Night in the Woods is one of the greatest indie games over the last decade. There's simply no words to describe my appreciation other than to say I can just end this video here, but there's just so much to talk about for a game that is essentially a third-person walking simulator, platformer, bass guitar hero, mystery adventure game that I feel I could almost talk for hours about it 5 years after its release, but I'll try to keep it to the basic story and themes. What appears at first glance as a game with very little going on with simple mechanical routine, getting out of bed, walking in the neighborhood, hanging with friends and family, etc. Narratively, there's a lot more going on beneath the surface. Night in the Woods really isn't a complicated game, mechanically speaking, so long as you can keep up with the respective songs and whether or not you're a careful thief when you need to be, but the complications come with how it presents the overall mystery going on around town, while presenting a heartfelt testimony on mental illness, alienation, and the loss of innocent youth. Just a forewarning, this retrospective review will contain spoilers, and will assume you had at least one playthrough. For the purpose of this review, I chose to play the Greg friendship route for game footage, but you really should get to playing both Greg and B's routes to grasp the whole story, as well as the extra minigames Lost Constellation and Longest Winter. It's fairly appropriate that the events during the game take place in the autumn, and why it's one of my go-to games when the leaves start to fall. What with school opening for the fall semester, football starting, and after that hockey and baseball, and the leaves falling down are seasonal reminders of what's to come. But for Margaret Borowski, or Mae, our main character, the fall season is a reminder of how down she's been. Recently dropping out of college and forced to move back in with her parents and without a job, Mae takes up exploring her hometown of Possum Springs in Deep Hollow County, taking daily walks and hops on buildings and cable wires around town and connecting or reconnecting with some of the folks along the way, including her three closest friends, Greg, Angus, and B. But a game which involves walking through town all the time would be boring in and of itself, and so throughout the game, there's a deeper, darker mystery going on. Well, two of them actually, one involving the town and what's going on with Mae, and why she couldn't deal with college. It's safe to say, when trying to describe the experience of Night in the Woods to someone unfamiliar with the game, I would describe it with only one word: home. Or if you want to be more precise, to quote a song title, home is where the haunt is. I think a lot of my audience who grew up in suburban neighborhoods could relate to all four of the main characters when they experience Possum Springs decaying before their eyes. Not just the obvious economic downturn it's facing with folks leaving for the city and local businesses closing, but the memories of childhood and teenage years, the pizza place down the block your family used to order from on weekends, the movie theater on Main Street in town, the video store where you could still rent old VHS tapes, the little statues of historic important figures remembered for regulars, visitors, and new residents. A lot of this stuff is relatable, I'm sure, for a lot of you. But then there's the feeling that your hometown is not enough, that there's a whole world to explore, and sticking around one place for too long could waste somebody's life. Unless, of course, their financial situation keeps them from being able to afford an apartment in the closest city or maybe even further away. This leads to an interesting comparison between Mae's three best friends. While Greg and Angus are trying to save enough money to move to Bright Harbor, Bee's family's financial situation forces her to stick around and run the old pickaxe, having to abandon the idea of going to college and take care of her father and her late mother during her cancer treatment and after her death. For these characters, home is a place to escape or to be trapped in for years. So for these three, they're trying to get by as best as they can prior to the events of the game before Mae interrupts them. Then there's the worry you might get homesickness, and for Mae, home is not to escape from or trap, but a safe haven. As the town motto says, you're not lost, you're here. Well, Mae clearly is feeling homesick, because why else would she bother to come back home? And we also learn that she developed a disassociation disorder in the events before the main story. We don't know exactly what she's been diagnosed with, but it's safe to assume it's the reason she has these awkward encounters with some of the locals and people stopping by for a day, and why, later before the game's climax, she explains how she sees every object and person as shapes without meaning, and why she carries a journal given to her by the one local crank doctor, Dr. Hank. But then, why would she want to come back to a place where some of her worst moments happen? Most of the town knows who she is, like the old man earlier in the game who tells her they don't forget what she did, specifically killing an unseen character, Andy Collin, years before the game's events, beating his head in with a softball bat during an episode due to her disassociation. We never get to see the incident, just townsfolk like the old man explaining that they remember, and Maury who's morbidly curious to the point of pestering Mae into annoyance. Mae also has a difficult time trying to fully explain why she left college, especially with her parents who joke a little about her sleeping late and trying to find a job earlier in the game, before Mae has an argument with her mother about her being the only one in her family to leave college before the Harfest in town. This leads me to discuss the character of Mae, and whether she is a great character, a reliable narrator of her own story, or whether her self-hatred and or unpleasant and sometimes disrespectful behavior is too much for her friends, family, and others for players to tolerate. From my playing experience, the intention of the authors behind making Mae the main character in Night in the Woods is to create empathy for the player, regardless of whether or not we have a family history of mental illness. Player choice still matters, but it's limited to keeping the story linear. You don't have a choice to create an appropriate response to avoid, say, Mae's argument with her mother Candy, or her meltdown with Pastor K, or her drunken rant in front of Cole and the campfire party. Just what words you say that have already been given to you by the writers. At the start of the game, Mae's return is a surprise and a disappointment to her friends and others, as she is the only one without a job, but also because for a brief moment besides Casey, asterisk on that, she was the only one who got away from Possum Springs, but now she's back with little to no direction, and at the end of the game, it's not clear as to whether or not the events that have unfolded change her as to what she wants to do in life. Of course, the diary writing and continuing to open up with her parents and friends is part of her self-care, but in the end, she's still just as directionless as she was in the beginning. No school, no job, the last day of the game is just another stroll through town before the last band practice. Greg, who Mae was best friends with in high school and who may or may have an undiagnosed disorder himself, is probably closer to Mae's personality, at least when you compare him to his partner Angus. While Angus is shy, soft-spoken, and until the middle to end of the game guarded about his true emotions, Greg is more than eager to reunite with Mae and revisit younger years. But this does have limitations. Greg has a job at the Snack Falcon, and depending on the mini games you do with him, you either are successful or you just end up hurting yourself even more. Just look at the knife duel, for example, and if you do poorly like I did the first time, Mae will not have had that much fun. Or even when you're putting together the mechanical robot, Mae still gets shocked to Greg's entertainment. B, the perpetually smoking owner of the old pickaxe, however, is probably the most deep character of the four, both on a written and emotional level. While Mae has it easy as her parents are pretty lenient on letting her roam around Possum Springs, B has a lot more on her plate, running the pickaxe and making sure her father doesn't try and commit suicide, and forced to abandon plans to go to college away from town and setting her family back financially after her mother's death from cancer. Despite her and Mae having been best friends before high school, their relationship fell apart and each person has different accounts as to why they drifted away from each other until the game's events. I played B's route during the first playthrough of Night in the Woods years ago, and while I didn't grasp the entire story in one try, after a few runs, it's amazing how B is willing to tolerate Mae that much and how it says so much about how she is written. I would argue that in another world or in a hypothetical sequel, B would probably be the most appropriate candidate to be the protagonist. In fact, sometimes as I'm playing B's route with Mae, I wonder why she wasn't the protagonist the whole time. If you would allow me for a moment, I would like to offer a theory as to why Mae sees shapes as opposed to real people in her life and in her dreams, and how this makes her disassociate from people. I'm not really sure if this theory has been discussed elsewhere, but the way she sees shapes in her life, the shapes could take the form of animals, the people in town, the constellations in the sky she sees through the telescope with Master Chazokov, and the many mythical creatures and gods she comes across in her dreams. Of course, there's the stereotype of depressed people owning cats and dogs, and how owning a pet
can alleviate one's life slightly. So there's something interesting about how a game like this one explores depression and mental illness with the aid of animals interacting with one another. Now, of course, you can just dismiss this theory by saying, well, the game is animated, so talking animals is nothing new in an animated setting, even for a mature story. But it does seem a little weird that non-talkative cats walk on all four legs and lay on buildings like a cat, and yet Mae, her grandfather, Casey, Bruce, and every other townsfolk who's a cat is a citizen walking on two legs like a human. Maybe this has to do with the old stories her late grandfather used to tell her before bedtime, like in the platforming minigame Lost Constellation, where talking animals are present as well. Perhaps this game is a commentary on how we write stories and cope with an ever-changing world which we don't have control over, as leaders dictate and legislate our lives and we have little input apart from our activism and voices. This leads me on to the next section on Possum Springs as a whole and how it relates to the real world.
One of the many qualities that have made this game stick out for me years after its release is the world building. A lot of what makes Night in the Woods so engaging is that you have the choice to interact with the main story and hang out with your friends, or wait a little while and explore the town of Possum Springs for however long you want, despite the limitations preventing you from exploring the whole of Possum Springs due to construction and roadblocks. Whether I was hanging more with Greg or B didn't matter in my choice to learn more about the town and its people, and doing so helps to make the game feel like reading a great American novel over and over again, and never losing interest, especially when you're playing the weird autumn edition of the game and interacting with characters like Rosa, who tells you old tales about Mae's grandfather. And I really do mean this is an American tale, because for a real-world comparison, Possum Springs is based on rural Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has been the setting for multiple pieces of media, whether it's the classic Billy Joel song Allentown, HBO's miniseries Mayor of Easttown, or the recently cancelled Showtime series American Rust, which was based on a novel with the same name. This is no accident. Pennsylvania, along with states like Wisconsin and Michigan and parts of New York, Illinois, and Ohio, are part of what is called the Rust Belt, a region of the United States which has faced economic and industrial decline since the latter half of the 20th century, with a heavy loss and outsourcing of coal mining and manufacturing jobs going overseas. The Rust Belt has also been crucial in determining who will win important elections in the United States, with Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin helping Donald Trump win the presidential election in 2016, and Biden in 2020, despite the threat of an insurrectionist movement that would not accept the results of the election. Because of this real-world background and history, there was some minor controversy after the release of this game from some gamers and commentators who accused Night in the Woods of being a Trumpian game, especially considering the 2017 release months after, well, that election. Night in the Woods never says it agrees with the sentiments of folks like the city council or the cult you meet at the end, but rather, just like with Mae's character and her well-being, it goes out of its way to empathize with the citizen's family or otherwise, and see how their economic situation makes them feel lost as their once decent jobs crumble and safety net dwindles. In other words, Night in the Woods is South Park for Bernie Bros. I mean, it's another piece of media involving a main gang of 4 adult, kids. For example, when interacting with Mae's father, Stan, you learn that he, like his father, Mae's grandfather, once worked decent manufacturing jobs including glassmaking and mining, jobs which not only made him feel more productive despite his battle with alcoholism, but it made him feel more worthwhile, like it was worth the pay to provide for his family. Nowadays, however, he's working a low-wage job slicing meats at the Ham Panther in town, where you could stop by. You learn that Stan isn't working this job because he likes it. He does it because, well, he has to so he can keep the health insurance, and also because the store's union isn't strong enough to fight for better labor protections. Stan's story is just one of many in town, but there's also the drifter named Bruce, who sleeps outside the church of the First Coalescence, and for whom Pastor K, the minister at the church, is trying to keep safe by giving him somewhere to sleep. And maybe he was supposed to have that secret apartment you find in the middle of town, where you feed the rats. Like Stan, Bruce is an alcoholic who's trying to get by, even as the city council clashes with Pastor K over keeping Bruce around and practically calling him a bum. And while we're on the subject of Possum Springs as Mae's home and how the townsfolk's economic well-being matters more than you think. Mae's brief interaction with a Navy recruiter offers her a way out of Possum Springs, but it also shows how military recruitment will exploit those who are poor and or have no direction like Mae, and despite her saying she wants to ride a submarine, she declines. Of course, Mae wouldn't have to join anyway since her family is her safety net, if you look past the fact that Mae's parents have mortgage issues with their house and may not be living in it for long, which explains the boxes. Kind of like how B's family switched to living in an apartment after her mom's death. I should probably mention the fact that despite the accusations of Trumpism leveled at the game, the main cast of characters is pretty diverse, at least in terms of gender and sexual preference. Mae is pansexual and Greg and Angus are a couple. As for B, however, I had the assumption that she may have been transgender, but the creators confirmed that B was the only straight member of the gang. And it's not as if the three non-straight characters are unaware that they're the only people on the LGBTQ spectrum in town and how that makes them feel like outsiders, as we see during the scene outside the Donut Wolf with Mae, Greg, and Angus talking. But it's easy to see how some people might get that impression, as it doesn't outright condemn some of the more questionable comments coming from Possum Springs citizens. Case in point, the construction worker fixing the path to the Church of the First Coalescence after the storm, spouting a bunch of "government is the problem" babble, or Andrew, Kathleen, Colleen, and Gary, who run the city council, and what a coincidence, also happen to be another group of four who go around town sticking together. Hell, it's almost kind of a scary foreshadowing as to what could happen if Mae, B, Greg, and Angus stick around for too long, getting way too conservative as they get older. Of course, there's all of the Nuke Possum Springs graffiti on the walls of buildings in the mural, which we later find out was done by Lori in an act of destruction which could probably mirror what Mae would have done at a younger age, and definitely one of Mae's dreams throughout the game. On a deeper level, I could see how the phrase Nuke Possum Springs could have a deeper meaning than just graffiti. That is, the destruction of the suburban hometown as part of one's identity and history, and trying desperately to create a new identity and meaning for either Mae or Lori, if only they had the means to do so. Going back to the church for a moment, the creators go out of their way to create a rich mythology filled with gods, deities, and cautionary tales, and we learn a lot about these figures and folk tales from observing the constellations and their respective backstories with Mr. Chazokov, and afterwards, if we choose to go with Angus to find clues as to who's the quote-unquote ghost, we find out he knows a lot of these stories as well, or at least that's what Mae thinks given his skepticism, and how Angus acts in the extra minigame Longest Night, where he explains to the gang some of the constellations in the sky, despite the game ending with Mae having dreamt up the entire Campfire interaction. We know Angus is the atheist of the group, and how his upbringing as an abused child and his curiosity contributed to how he sees the world, and in contrast, and to my surprise, B is a believer, or at the very least an agnostic God-believing theist, despite the goth look which would suggest otherwise, and having to deal with a lot on her plate, having to run the pickaxe, taking care of her father, and mourning the loss of her mother, even with Mae having a, to put it politely, spotty memory. And as for Mae, it's really up to the player to decide how Mae chooses to explain her religious views, whether or not her dreams have a much deeper meaning, and if any of these gods are real according to her, what that says about Mae's mental health and coping with her struggles throughout the game, though none of that changes the way she gets heated in front of Pastor K, leading up to her coma and to the final cult confrontation. Speaking of which, all of the themes and little tidbits out of the way, we can talk about the main antagonists of the game, the cult, and whether they either make or break the game for most people, the mystery itself as to the disappearance of residents, and the ending. It turns out that, despite Mae convincing herself, along with her friends, that there is a ghost kidnapping kids around Possum Springs, the ghost isn't really a ghost at all, but a shadowy figure in a mechanical hat named Edid, which spelled backwards is E died, perhaps giving you a clue as to what he does, and he's part of a group of cult members who worship a deity called the Black Goat, whom you see a picture of if you choose to go with Greg into the historical museum, and as Edid is chasing you out of the building. Long before the events of the game, two miners, Ed and Jim, stumbled across a pit in hope of finding some minerals. Jim fell down and never hit the bottom, but Ed lived to tell the tale.
All of this occurred as the local economy took a downturn and people started leaving Possum Springs for elsewhere. So ever since the discovery of the bottomless pit, the cult has been making sacrifices to the goat god in the hope that Possum Springs will be prosperous once again. While interacting with the cult in the final confrontation, we find out that despite our assumption that Casey had hopped on a train away from Possum Springs, the cult members admit that Casey was part of their ritual, effectively meaning they killed him. Maybe there's a chance that the members are trying to provoke them into a rage since Greg has his crossbow armed and ready, but since they're honest about it and are willing to let the four of them join them, it's probably best to assume they aren't lying about Casey's death. For the most part, Night in the Woods plays out as a pretty decent mystery, and we do get some hint or closure as to the whereabouts of Casey. There is a tragic irony to Mae's ghost theory, however. The assumption at the start of the game is that Casey ghosted and went off on a train away from Possum Springs for reasons that aren't exactly clear as the gang discusses this at the Click Clack Diner when Mae arrives. And then there's the away message on Casey's computer that never changes even after he's gone off. Or gone for good. Well, he is gone for good, just not the way that we thought. As for the villains, I actually think that the sacrificing goat cult is a pretty appropriate group of villains given the setting where the game takes place and all of the previous mythology and underlying town politics explored. While Night in the Woods has a genuine respect for mythology and religion, the cult is an extremist depiction of religion, using their worship of the goat god and combining it with their conservative politics and their desperation to get their past lives back. They might be absolutely wrong, factually and morally in their universe, but their anger is genuine. With a crumbling safety net like ours in the real world, they turn towards extremism. It's worth noting that the goat cult and Pastor K are on opposite sides of the extreme. While Pastor K, an agnostic theist like B, and the new leader of the town's church, sees religion as a force for good and wants to help the homeless and downtrodden find shelter like Bruce to better their material well-being, the cult is only interested in how their sacrificing makes the town money, and yet are so desperately convinced that the sacrifices are having the wanted effect, even if, say, the food donkey or possibilities are closed. If anything, the cult has more in common with the council, who effectively tell Bruce to fuck off out of town and are also interested in bringing the town money. But the council shows up at the end debunking any potential cult membership. Their brand of suburban hometown conservatism is, more diplomatic. However, I can't end this video without mentioning the elephant in the room, the music. A lot of critical acclaim for this game was given to the game's soundtrack, and some of the songs that the four friends play as a band describe or foreshadow events within the story. Having played this game one too many times, it's hard not to hum along to songs like Die Anywhere Else or Weird Autumn, even while not nailing the bass guitar hero minigame, and it's also fun to notice when you know the musical cues for Greg and B while doing their respective side quests. Another point that makes B's character probably the best is how, despite her hardship, her theme song sounds rather positive. The music composer was Alec, a recognizable name in indie gaming even before Night in the Woods' release, and who also coded the game, and while I don't think he had any, if at all, little input as far as the story goes, his fingerprints are all over this game. Having a recognizable soundtrack to go along with a compelling story was one of the reasons this game was critically and commercially successful half a decade ago, but there was an awful lot of behind-the-scenes drama involving Alec not being on his best behavior towards the other creators of the game, Scott Benson and Bethany Hockenberry, the writers and co-designers, and had the situation with Alec been limited to the game's creation and nothing else, then we could chalk this up as a successful indie game that also had a testy behind-the-scenes scenario. But then there's the harassment and abuse allegations against him, along with his suicide following the release of these allegations, and well, this paints the game in a really uncomfortable light, not just from a retrospective perspective 5 years or so after its release. As explained previously, the mystery of the cult is solved, but as to Mae and what happens after, there really isn't a real concrete answer. We don't know if she gets better, finds a job, or if she's gonna move out with her parents due to mortgage issues. An intentional and not. This says a lot about how we should deal with those who are struggling with their mental health, and how we should care and support them even if they do or have done horrific, awful things, as is the case with Alec. And while I believe the women who were victims of Alec's abuse, and there is no reason not to believe the women who spoke out, what makes this situation all the more maddening and sad is that we'll never hear him hold himself accountable, nor will he manage to take care of his well-being even after doing such horrific acts. I can't speak for the creators of this game. I can only speak as to how I feel about what he did to the women abused, so I suggest reading this post by Scott Benson in the description because it explains it all as delicately as possible, both as a collaborator and as someone who got some brunt of the abuse, but this highlighted paragraph gets the point across more or less. While I praise Alec's work, consider this: people left the industry because of what he did. People gave up their dreams, the art they wanted to make. People, drawn by the promise of working with a well-known indie developer, found themselves caught between giving up their dreams of financial stability and getting away from him. People spent years with him as a destructive presence in their lives. People developed PTSD. People spent hours and money on therapy. People felt trapped by him. It's hard for me to see how one man's work is worth what he did to so many others. End of quote. Night in the Woods is a masterclass in world building and storytelling with an indie budget, and putting aside that giant musical elephant, whatever minor complaints, nitpicks there are, the main story is what keeps me replaying it over and over when the leaves start to change color and the weather gets cooler. And despite discussing to a certain degree the main themes, interpretations, and political implications of what the game communicates, I have only scratched the surface as to what makes this game a fantastic playthrough again and again, especially if you choose to play it in the autumn like I do. And I haven't even mentioned details like the goth kids at the edge of the cliff, Lori's character and how she mirrors Mae in terms of destructive behavior, some of Mae and B's adventures together during B's route, including the college town in this world's version of Hot Topic at the mall, and how it commodifies counterculture, the Telesoft employees and their conversations during their coffee and cigarette breaks outside in town, and especially some of the theories as to whether or not the janitor is this world's version of God. But like I said at the beginning, that could go on for hours on end. Sure, there are annoying nitpicks like how the game doesn't have a health bar when Mae jumps high off a building onto the sidewalk, yet Greg practically dies when you drop the machine down the stairs. But those nitpicks are just minor and don't diminish the playing experience. Night in the Woods teaches us that underneath the ugliness of this world, in even the small towns you grew up in, you'll find a little bit of beauty if you can. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video essay, please consider giving it a comment and like, and if you want to see more essays like this, please consider subscribing to help support this channel. Hopefully this year I will be able to contribute to interesting conversations about philosophy, politics, and video games, among other subjects.